The courtroom was suffocating, filled with the smell of stale coffee and expensive lies. Everyone's eyes were glued to the trembling man in the defendant's chair, James Vance, a man accused of stealing millions. They called him a fraud, a thief, a liar. But while the prosecutor screamed and the corrupt billionaire smirked, nobody noticed the woman sitting alone in the very last row. She wore a frayed grey cardigan and looked at the floor, invisible to the world. They thought she was just the pathetic wife of a criminal. They had no idea that she was the most powerful person in the room, and she was about to burn their entire world to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the Superior Court of Manhattan had never felt more like the gates of a tomb than they did on that rainy Tuesday in November. Inside courtroom 402, the air was thick with tension and the low, buzzing murmur of the press. They were like vultures, waiting for the carcass of a reputation to be picked clean. Sitting at the defense table, James Vance stared at his hands. They were shaking. He clasped them together, trying to stop the tremors, but the cold knot of fear in his stomach made it impossible to find any stillness. He was an architect, a builder of safe havens, a man who designed libraries and schools. He wasn't a criminal. Yet, here he was, facing 20 years in federal prison for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. "Straighten your tie, James," his public defender, a weary man named Arthur Miller, whispered. Arthur was a good man, but he was overworked, underpaid, and visibly intimidated by the legal sharks sitting across the aisle. "Don't let them see you sweat. That's what Thorne wants." James looked up, his eyes drifting across the courtroom. At the prosecution's table sat Gavin Thorne. Thorne was less of a lawyer and more of a televised executioner. He wore a three-piece Italian suit that cost more than James's car, and his smile was a razor blade wrapped in silk. He was the district attorney's golden boy, the man who had never lost a high-profile case because he knew exactly how to twist the truth until it snapped. But the real danger wasn't Thorne. It was the man sitting in the gallery, directly behind the prosecution, legs crossed comfortably. Matteo Sterling. Matteo was the CEO of Sterling Developments, James's former partner and best friend of 15 years. Matteo was the one who had siphoned the $50 million from the affordable housing project. Matteo was the one who had forged James's digital signature on the offshore accounts. And now, Matteo was the star witness for the state, the grieving business partner forced to turn in his friend for the greater good. James felt bile rise in his throat. He turned his head, looking away from Matteo's arrogant gaze, and scanned the back of the room. There she was, Emilia. His wife sat in the very last row, wedged between a sleeping bailiff and a cracked plaster pillar. She looked smaller than usual today. She was wearing her old grey wool cardigan, the one with the loose thread on the sleeve, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, messy bun. She wore no makeup, and the fluorescent lights of the courtroom washed her out, making her look pale, almost ghostly. To the rest of the room, she was nobody, just the disgraced wife of a soon-to-be convict, a woman who probably clipped coupons and didn't understand the complexities of high finance. James's heart ached. He had begged her not to come. He didn't want her to see this. He didn't want her to see him destroyed. But Emilia had insisted. "I need to see their faces, James," she had said over breakfast, her voice strangely calm as she buttered toast. "I need to see exactly who they are." Now she sat there, head bowed, scribbling intently into a small, leather-bound notebook she balanced on her knee. She hadn't looked up once since the proceedings began. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed, startling James out of his trance. Judge Silas Holloway swept into the room. Holloway was a mountain of a man, with a face like a bulldog and a reputation for being harsh on white-collar crime, or rather, harsh on certain white-collar criminals. It was an open secret in the legal community that Holloway and Matteo Sterling played golf at the same exclusive country club in the Hamptons. "Be seated," Holloway grunted, banging his gavel with unnecessary force. He glared over his spectacles at James. "Docket number 4449, the People versus James Vance. We are resuming with the prosecution's opening statement. Mr. Thorne, the floor is yours." Gavin Thorne stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. He didn't walk to the podium. He prowled the center of the room, making eye contact with every juror. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thorne began, his voice a rich baritone that commanded attention. "Greed. It is a simple, ugly word. We like to think that the men who build our cities, the architects who design our skylines, are men of vision. But James Vance is not a man of vision. He is a man of appetite." Thorne spun around, pointing a manicured finger directly at James. "He stole $50 million intended for the poor," Thorne boomed. "Money meant for single mothers, for veterans, for the homeless. He took that money to fund a secret life of luxury, while his partner, Mr. Sterling, worked tirelessly to save the project. Today, we will show you the bank transfers. We will show you the emails. And we will show you that behind that facade of a humble family man lies a predator." James shrank in his seat. It was all lies. The emails were fabricated. The bank transfers were routed through shell companies Matteo owned, but hacked to look like James's. In the back row, Amelia Vance didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply turned a page in her notebook. The sound of the crisp paper turning was the only noise she made. She wrote 3 words in elegant, sharp cursive. "Thorne. Opening. Perjury." She looked up then, her eyes locking onto the back of Judge Holloway's head. Her expression wasn't one of fear. It was the cold, clinical calculation of a predator watching prey that didn't yet know it was being hunted. The morning session was a bloodbath. Thorne called his first 3 witnesses in rapid succession. First, a nervous accountant from the firm who admitted, under intense pressure, that he had seen James acting suspiciously near the secure servers. Then, a forensic analyst who presented a slideshow of the stolen funds moving into an account in the Cayman Islands bearing James's name. "Mr. Miller," Judge Holloway barked at James's lawyer, "do you have any cross-examination for the analyst?" Arthur Miller stood up, shuffling his papers nervously. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Analyst, isn't it true that the IP address used to access these accounts can be spoofed?" "It's possible," the analyst shrugged, clearly coached by Thorne, "but highly unlikely given the encryption level." "But isn't it true," Miller pressed, "that Mr. Vance was at a parent-teacher conference at the exact time the transfer was authorized?" "Objection!" Thorne shouted, leaping to his feet. "Relevance! The transfer could have been automated." "Sustained," Judge Holloway drawled, looking bored. "Move on, Mr. Miller." James put his head in his hands. The judge wasn't even letting them fight. Then came the main event. "The prosecution calls Matteo Sterling to the stand," Thorne announced. A ripple of excitement went through the gallery. Matteo Sterling stood up, adjusting his silk tie. He walked to the stand with the confident stride of a man who owned the building. He was handsome, in a rugged, polished way, with silver fox hair and a sympathetic smile that melted the hearts of the jury. He was sworn in. "Mr. Sterling," Thorne said softly, adopting a tone of shared sorrow, "tell us about your relationship with the defendant." Matteo sighed, looking over at James with eyes full of fake pity. "James was my brother. In spirit, anyway. We started Sterling Developments in a garage. I trusted him with my life. When I found out what he had done, when I saw the missing money, it broke my heart. Did you confront him? Thorne asked. I did, Matteo lied smoothly. He laughed in my face. He told me that I was too stupid to catch him. He said he deserved the money because he was the creative genius, and I was just the suit. Liar! James shouted, unable to stop himself. I never said that. You came to me begging for a loan to cover your gambling debts. Order! Judge Holloway slammed the gavel down so hard the wood cracked. Mr. Vance, another outburst like that, and I will have you bound and gagged. The jury will disregard the defendant's outburst. Matteo looked at the jury and shook his head sadly, as if James's shout just proved how unstable he was. I tried to cover for him at first, Matteo continued, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. I thought he was sick, but when I realized he was stealing from the orphanage fund, I had to go to the police. In the back row, Emilia stopped writing. She watched Matteo Sterling carefully. She noticed the way he tapped his left foot when he lied. She noticed the way he glanced at Judge Holloway for approval after every major statement. She reached into her oversized, battered tote bag. She didn't pull out a tissue. She didn't pull out a snack. She pulled out a pair of heavy, black-rimmed spectacles and slid them onto her face. Then, she pulled out a second document, a thick stack of papers bound with a red clip. It wasn't a notebook. It was a transcript of a deposition from a case 5 years prior in Chicago, a case called Estate versus Sterling Construction. A young bailiff, a man named Officer O'Malley, was standing near the back row. He looked down at the woman in the grey cardigan. He saw the document she was holding. He squinted at the header. Department of Justice, sealed indictment. O'Malley froze. He looked at the woman's face. The grey cardigan and the messy hair had fooled everyone. But with the glasses on and her posture suddenly straightening, she looked familiar. Terrifyingly familiar. Emilia caught the bailiff staring. She didn't smile. She simply raised a single finger to her lips. Shh. Officer O'Malley swallowed hard and looked away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew who she was. He had seen her face on the news during the Supreme Court nomination hearings last year, though she had declined the seat to remain in the field. Why was the director of the Federal Judicial Oversight Commission sitting in the back of a dirty Manhattan courtroom, dressed like a librarian? The lunch recess was called. The courtroom emptied. James was allowed 15 minutes with his lawyer and his wife in a small holding room. He looked defeated. His skin was grey. It's over, Emilia, James whispered, burying his face in her shoulder. She smelled of vanilla and old paper. Matteo has the jury eating out of his hand, and the judge, Holloway, hates me. I don't know why, but he hates me. Arthur Miller, the lawyer, paced the small room. I can't get an objection in edgewise. Holloway is blocking every line of defense. It's like they rehearsed this. Emilia pulled back from James. For the first time all day, her eyes were blazing. The meek housewife demeanor evaporated. Her spine straightened, and her voice dropped an octave, losing its soft, comforting edge and becoming hard as steel. They did rehearse it, Arthur, Emilia said. Arthur stopped pacing. He looked at her, confused. Excuse me, Mrs. Vance. Holloway and Sterling, Emilia said, her voice crisp. They didn't just rehearse it. They planned it. 6 months ago, at the Sapphire Club. Dinner, table 4. James looked at his wife, stunned. Emilia, how could you possibly know that? Emilia stood up. She walked over to the small, dirty window of the holding room. Because, James, I haven't been just working late at the library for the last 6 months, and I certainly wasn't visiting my mother in Vermont last week. She turned back to them. Arthur, hand me your case file, on the structural integrity of the buildings Matteo claimed James neglected. I don't have that organized yet," Arthur stammered. "Get it," Emilia commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order given by someone used to commanding armies of lawyers. "And Arthur, when we go back in there, I want you to do exactly one thing. When Matteo is back on the stand, I want you to ask him about the Antigua Protocol." "The what?" Arthur asked. "I don't see that in the discovery documents." "It's not in the discovery," Emilia said, "because if it were, Matteo Sterling would already be in handcuffs. Ask him. And when the judge tries to overrule you, and he will, I want you to state clearly for the record, the defense requests the court recognize the presence of a federal observer." "A federal observer?" Arthur laughed nervously. "Emilia, honey, there's no federal observer here. It's just us." Emilia walked over to her husband. She smoothed his collar, her touch gentle, but her eyes fierce. "James," she said softly. "Do you trust me?" "With my life," he said. "Then stop shaking," she said. "The trial hasn't even started yet. We let them have the morning. We let them get comfortable. We let them think they are gods in this room." She checked her watch, a simple, cheap digital watch, or so it appeared. She pressed a sequence of buttons on the side. "But gods bleed," she whispered. "And at 2 p.m. we are going to make them bleed." A knock on the door. "Recess is over," the bailiff called. As they walked back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. The air pressure felt lower. Judge Holloway was already on the bench, picking his teeth with a toothpick. Matteo Sterling was back on the stand, looking refreshed and smug. Prosecutor Thorne was laughing at something his assistant had said. They were celebrating. They thought the kill was guaranteed. Emilia took her seat in the back row again, but this time she didn't hunch over. She took off the grey cardigan. Underneath, she wore a simple white blouse, but she buttoned it all the way to the top. She placed the red-clipped document on the bench beside her. Officer O'Malley, the bailiff who had recognized her, was standing by the door. He caught her eye. He gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. He had done what she asked during the break. He had made the call. Judge Holloway banged the gavel. "Mr. Miller, your witness, cross-examination." Arthur Miller stood up. He looked at Emilia in the back. She nodded once. Arthur took a deep breath. He walked toward Matteo Sterling. He didn't look like a defeated public defender anymore. He looked like a man holding a grenade. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice steady, "you testified that my client managed all the finances, correct?" "That's right," Matteo smiled. "And you had no knowledge of the offshore accounts?" "None whatsoever. I'm a builder, not a banker." Arthur paused. "Then can you explain to the jury what the Antigua Protocol is?" The color drained from Matteo Sterling's face, so fast it looked like he had been slapped. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Objection!" Thorne screamed, sensing the danger instantly. "There is no such thing in the evidence. Counsel is fishing." "Sustained," Judge Holloway barked immediately, glaring at Arthur. "Mr. Miller, stick to the facts in evidence or I will hold you in contempt." Arthur didn't back down. He remembered Emilia's instruction. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "The defense has reason to believe that evidence has been suppressed by this court. Therefore, the defense requests the court recognize the presence of a federal observer." Judge Holloway laughed. It was a cruel, wet sound. "A federal observer? In my courtroom? Mr. Miller, have you lost your mind? There is no federal observer here. Sit down before I have you arrested." "Actually," a voice rang out from the back of the room. It was a calm voice, melodic, but it carried a weight that stopped the air in everyone's lungs. Emilia Vance stood up. She didn't look like a housewife anymore. She stood with her shoulders back, her chin high. She picked up the red-clipped document. "Actually, Judge Holloway," she said, stepping out of the row and walking into the aisle. "There is." "Sit down, ma'am," Judge Holloway shouted, his face turning purple. "Bailiff, remove this woman. Remove the defendant's wife immediately." Officer O'Malley stepped forward. But he didn't move toward Amelia. He moved toward the gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. He unlatched it and held it open. "You may proceed, ma'am," Officer O'Malley said, his voice trembling slightly. "Bailiff," Holloway screamed. "Are you deaf? I said remove her." Amelia walked through the gate. She walked past her husband, who was staring at her with his mouth open. She walked past the prosecutor, who was looking at her with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. She stopped directly in front of the judge's bench. "Silas Holloway," she said, dropping the honorific title entirely. "You have denied 3 motions for discovery. You have sustained 14 objections without basis, and you have failed to disclose that your mortgage was paid off in full by a shell company linked to Sterling Developments 3 days before this trial began." The courtroom gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Who do you think you are?" Holloway hissed, standing up, his robes billowing. "I will have you thrown in a cell for a month." Amelia reached into her tote bag one last time. She pulled out a leather wallet. She flipped it open. A gold badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Beside it was an ID card with a diagonal red stripe, the mark of high-level clearance. "I am not just James's wife," she said, her voice projecting to every corner of the room without a microphone. "I am Amelia Vance Strathmore, Chief Justice of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals and Chair of the Judicial Integrity Task Force." She slammed the red-clipped folder onto the defense table. "And you, Judge Holloway, are sitting in my seat." The silence that followed Amelia's declaration was absolute. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for the seconds after a bomb detonates, before the screaming starts. Judge Silas Holloway stood frozen behind his high bench, his face a mask of disbelief that was rapidly crumbling into terror. His hand was still gripping the gavel, but his knuckles were white, the blood drained entirely from his grip. "You," Holloway stammered, his voice no longer the booming baritone of authority. It was a thin, reedy sound. "You are impersonating a federal officer. That is a felony. Officer O'Malley, arrest her. I am ordering you to arrest her." Officer O'Malley didn't move toward Amelia. Instead, he turned his back on the judge. He walked over to the side door of the courtroom, the secure entrance usually reserved for the judge himself, and unlocked it. "I can't do that, Silas," O'Malley said, his voice shaking but resolute. He, too, dropped the "Your Honor." "Because she's not impersonating anyone." The door swung open. 6 men and women in tactical gear poured into the courtroom. They didn't look like local police. They wore dark navy windbreakers with yellow lettering across the back and chest. U.S. Marshals. They moved with terrifying efficiency. 2 of them flanked the exit doors, blocking anyone from leaving. 2 moved toward the jury box, instructing the terrified jurors to remain seated for their safety. And 2 of them marched directly up the steps to the judge's bench. "Silas Holloway," the lead marshal announced, his voice flat and professional. "You are under arrest for racketeering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Step away from the bench." "This is a mistake," Holloway shrieked, backing up until he hit the wall behind him. "I am a judge of the Superior Court. You have no jurisdiction here. Get Gavin Thorne. Gavin, tell them." Holloway looked desperately toward the prosecution table. Gavin Thorne, the razor-sharp prosecutor who had spent the morning tearing James Vance apart, was currently busy trying to shove a stack of files into his briefcase with trembling hands. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at the floor, trying to make himself invisible. "Mr. Thorne," Amelia said. She hadn't moved. She stood in the center of the aisle, a calm island in the storm she had summoned. "I wouldn't close that briefcase if I were you. Marshal, secure the prosecution's evidence. It contains the altered bank records." "You have no proof!" Matteo Sterling shouted. He had leapt up from the witness stand, his face flushed red. The cool, collected CEO was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. "This is a circus. James put you up to this. It's a stunt." Amelia turned her head slowly to look at Matteo. The movement was so deliberate, so predatory, that Matteo actually took a step back, bumping into the witness stand microphone. It let out a high-pitched squeal of feedback that made everyone wince. "A stunt?" Amelia asked softly. She walked toward the witness stand. She moved with a grace that James had never seen before. At home, she was clumsy. She tripped over the rug. She dropped mugs. But here, in this arena, she moved like water. "Matteo," she said, stopping 10 feet from him. "Do you remember the barbecue at our house 3 years ago, the 4th of July?" Matteo blinked, confused by the non sequitur. "What? What does that have to do with—" "You were drunk," Amelia continued, her voice conversational but carrying to the back of the room. "You were bragging about your new boat. You told James that the hull was made of a new composite material, lighter than anything on the market. You said, 'Amelia, the key to success isn't working hard. It's knowing where the cracks are in the system.'" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I sat there eating potato salad, listening to you, and I wondered, why would an architect be so obsessed with cracks? So the next day, I looked into your permits, not the ones you filed publicly, the ones you filed under Ironwood Holdings." Matteo's eyes widened. "How? That's a shell corporation. It's anonymous." "Nothing is anonymous, Matteo," Amelia said. "Not when you have the encryption keys to the Cayman national banking servers, which I obtained via a federal warrant 6 months ago." She turned to the gallery, addressing the stunned press corps. "Matteo Sterling didn't just steal $50 million, she announced. He used Ironwood Holdings to buy substandard steel from a blacklisted supplier in Eastern Europe. He put that steel into the foundations of the elementary school my husband designed. He pocketed the difference, and he framed James because James was the only one who would eventually notice the stress fractures." The courtroom erupted. The journalists were typing furiously on their phones. The jurors were gasping, looking from Matteo to James with wide eyes. James sat at the defense table, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't crying from fear anymore. He was crying from relief, and from the overwhelming shock of realizing that the woman he had shared his bed with for 10 years, the woman he thought needed his protection, was actually the one holding the shield. "Marshals," Amelia said, her voice snapping the room back to order. "Take Mr. Sterling into custody, and be careful with him. He's a flight risk. He has a plane fueled and waiting at Teterboro Airport, under the tail number N449 SZ. Matteo lunged. It happened in a blur, realizing his life was over, realizing the plane was burned and the money was gone. Matteo Sterling snapped. He lunged off the witness stand, not toward the door, but toward James. "You ruined everything," Matteo screamed, his hands reaching for James's throat. James flinched, raising his arms to protect his face, but Matteo never reached him. Amelia moved. She didn't use a weapon. She simply stepped into Matteo's path, pivoted on her heel, and used his own momentum against him. She grabbed his outstretched arm, twisted her hips, and slammed the CEO of Sterling Developments face first onto the courtroom floor with a sickening thud. She knelt on his back, pulling his arm up behind him until he whimpered in pain. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear. "You should have never," she whispered, "threatened my family." The marshals were there a second later, hauling Matteo up and slapping cuffs on him. Emilia stood up, smoothing her white blouse. She looked at her husband. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice suddenly soft again. James nodded, unable to speak. "Good," she said. She turned back to the empty judge's bench. "Now, we need a new judge, and lucky for us, I brought one." The transition of power was swift. Judge Holloway was led out in handcuffs, weeping openly. He was escorted through the same door he used to enter, bypassing the gallery, but the cameras caught the silver glint of the cuffs. It would be the front-page photo of every paper in New York the next morning. 10 minutes later, the side door opened again. A woman in flowing black robes entered. She was older, with steel-grey hair cut in a sharp bob and glasses that sat on the end of her nose. It was Judge Margaret Vance, no relation to James, but a legend in the Southern District of New York. She was known as the Iron Lady of Foley Square. She was retired, but she had been reactivated for this specific task force. "Be seated," Judge Margaret said. She didn't bang a gavel. She didn't need to. Her presence demanded silence. "The previous proceedings are hereby declared a mistrial due to judicial misconduct," she stated. However, given the extraordinary nature of the evidence presented by Chief Justice Vance Strathmore, this court is now convening a probable cause hearing for the arrest of Matteo Sterling and Gavin Thorne. Thorne, the prosecutor, tried to object. "Your Honor, I am a representative of the district attorney. You cannot arrest me." "Mr. Thorne," Judge Margaret said, looking over her glasses, "sit down before I add contempt to your list of charges. Chief Justice, proceed with the evidence." Emilia Vance stood at the prosecutor's podium now. She looked natural there. She opened the red-clipped file. "Thank you, Your Honor," Emilia said. "The defense, or rather, the actual prosecution, presents Exhibit A, the Antigua Protocol." She pulled a flash drive from her pocket and plugged it into the presentation system. The large screens in the courtroom flickered to life. It was a spreadsheet, a massive, complex web of numbers, dates, and names. "James Vance," Emilia began, gesturing to her husband, "is a meticulous architect. He documents everything, every screw, every bolt, every hour of labor. Matteo Sterling knew this. Matteo counted on James's obsession with detail to mask the fraud. Matteo thought that if he buried the fake transactions deep inside James's legitimate logs, no one would ever find them." She clicked a button. The spreadsheet highlighted several rows in red. "But Matteo made a mistake," Emilia said. "He didn't know that James writes his notes in a specific shorthand, a shorthand he developed in college. Look here." She zoomed in on a column labeled Material Costs, Sector 4. "See this code? JV11. That is James's code for verified concrete," Emilia explained. "Now look at the entries Matteo forged." She pointed to a row that looked identical to the others. "The code here is JV2, 2 capital I's instead of the number 11. To a banker, it looks the same. To an auditor, it looks the same. But to me?" She looked at James, a small, proud smile playing on her lips. "To me, it looked like a stranger trying to write in my husband's handwriting. I noticed it 3 months ago when James brought his work laptop home. I asked him about it. He said he didn't write it. That was the thread I pulled." She clicked the remote again. A new document appeared. It was an email chain. Once I isolated the fake entries, I traced the IP addresses. They didn't come from James's computer. They came from a secure server located in a penthouse apartment on Park Avenue. An apartment leased to—" She paused for dramatic effect. "Gavin Thorne." The courtroom gasped again. Thorne jumped up, knocking his chair over. "That's a lie. I've never been to that apartment." "Really?" Amelia asked. "Because we have security footage of you entering the building with Matteo Sterling on 12 separate occasions. And we have the bank records showing that Ironwood Holdings paid off your law school loans, all $200,000 of them, the day after you indicted my husband." Thorne slumped against the table. He looked like a deflated balloon. "The Antigua Protocol," Amelia continued, her voice hard, "was their exit strategy. They planned to convict James, seize his assets to pay off the debts Matteo owed to the Russian mob for the bad steel, and then retire to a villa in Antigua. They had the tickets purchased. They were leaving this Friday." She turned to the jury, who were watching the screen with rapt attention. "My husband isn't a criminal," Amelia said, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed emotion. "He's a patsy, a scapegoat chosen by his best friend because he was too honest to suspect treachery. James Vance built orphanages. Matteo Sterling built a cage to put him in." Amelia closed the folder. "The people rest," she said. Judge Margaret Vance nodded slowly. "The evidence is overwhelming. Bail is denied for both Mr. Sterling and Mr. Thorne. Marshals, remove them." As the marshals dragged a kicking and screaming Matteo and a weeping Thorne out of the courtroom, the gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters were shouting questions. The jury was talking excitedly amongst themselves. But in the center of the storm, James Vance sat perfectly still. He stared at the empty spot where his best friend had been. Then he stared at his wife. Amelia walked over to the defense table. She signaled for Arthur Miller to give them a moment. The lawyer, looking like he had just won the lottery without buying a ticket, happily stepped aside. Amelia sat in the chair next to James. She reached out and took his trembling hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. James looked at her. "Sorry. Amelia, you saved my life. You saved everything." "I lied to you," she said, looking down at their joined hands. "For 10 years. I told you I was a legal consultant for a non-profit. I couldn't tell you the truth. The task force, it requires total anonymity. If people knew who I was, I couldn't do what I do. I couldn't sit in the back rows of courtrooms and watch for corruption." James laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "So all those times you were baking cookies for the church fundraiser." "Surveillance operations," she admitted sheepishly. "And the time you went to that book club retreat in D.C. Testifying before a closed Senate committee regarding organized crime in the judiciary." James shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I thought you were boring, Amelia. I mean, I loved you, but I thought I was the exciting one with the architecture awards." "You are exciting," Amelia said fiercely. "You create things, James. You build. I just clean up messes." James squeezed her hand. "Well, you certainly cleaned up this one." He looked around the courtroom. "So, what happens now?" Amelia stood up, pulling him with her. "Now? The trial is over. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. The government will be seizing Matteo's assets. Sterling Developments is going to be liquidated." She paused, a mischievous glint in her eye. "And since I am the court-appointed trustee for the liquidation, I get to decide who finishes the contracts." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "The affordable housing project," Amelia said. "The orphanage. They still need to be built, and they need an architect who knows the plans, an architect who is honest." "I don't have a firm anymore, Amelia," James said. "Sterling Developments is gone." "True," Amelia said. She reached into her tote bag one last time. She pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a drawing, a sketch of a logo, Vance Architecture and Design. "I took the liberty of filing the incorporation papers this morning," she said. "While you were getting dressed, I also transferred the $50 million, the money we recovered from the Cayman account, into an escrow account for the project. It's fully funded, James, but only if you agree to run it." James looked at the sketch. He looked at his wife, the spy, the judge, the warrior. "I think," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I can manage that." "Good," Emilia said, "because we have one more problem to deal with." "What?" James asked, alarmed. "Is there another co-conspirator?" "No," Emilia said, checking her cheap digital watch again. "It's 3:30 p.m. We missed lunch, and I am starving." James burst out laughing. It was a loud, joyous sound that made the remaining people in the courtroom turn and look. "Come on, Chief Justice," James said, offering her his arm. "Let me buy you a burger. I know a place where they don't ask for ID." They walked out of the courtroom arm in arm. The press flashbulbs popped like lightning, but neither of them flinched. 1 year later, the autumn sun hung low over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, golden shadows that danced across the glass facade of the city's newest architectural marvel. It was a crisp November afternoon, exactly 365 days since the doors of courtroom 402 had swung shut on the life James Vance used to know. Standing on the corner of 5th Avenue and 110th Street, the Vance Community Center and Shelter did not look like a charity case. It did not look like a repository for the forgotten. It looked like a cathedral of light. The building was a stunning interplay of reinforced steel, warm reclaimed oak, and floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the clouds drifting above. It was transparent. It was open. It was everything the corrupt empire of Sterling Developments had not been. James Vance stood in the VIP holding tent, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. He looked older than he had a year ago, but it was a good kind of aging. The frantic, hollowed-out look of a man being hunted was gone, replaced by the weathered resilience of a man who had walked through fire. He smoothed the lapel of his navy suit, a suit he had bought with his own money, earned from legitimate commissions, not the scraps Matteo Sterling had thrown him. "You're fidgeting again," a soft voice came from behind him. James smiled at the reflection in the mirror. Emilia was standing there. If the world had underestimated Emilia Vance a year ago in her grey cardigan and messy bun, they wouldn't even recognize the woman standing there now. She wore a structured, crimson dress that fit her like armor, tailored to perfection. Her hair was no longer hidden. It cascaded in soft, dark waves around her shoulders. But the biggest change was in her eyes. They were no longer downcast. They were sharp, clear, and dancing with a quiet, dangerous intelligence. "I'm not fidgeting," James lied, turning to face her. "I'm just checking the stitching. You know how I am about details." "I do," Emilia said, stepping forward to straighten his tie herself. Her touch was warm. "That obsession with details is what saved us, remember? If you hadn't logged those concrete mixtures, I never would have found the thread to pull." James took her hands. "It feels strange, Emilia. Being here, celebrating, knowing where they are." He didn't have to say the names. They hung in the air between them, ghosts that had been exorcised but not forgotten. The fall of the Sterling conspiracy had been the most sensational legal collapse in New York history. It wasn't just a ripple. It was a tsunami that had washed away the grime of the city's construction industry. Matteo Sterling, the man who had once sipped scotch in penthouses and looked down on the world, was no longer looking down on anyone. The federal investigation Emilia had triggered, the Antigua Protocol, had uncovered far more than embezzlement. It had revealed a decade of money laundering for Eastern European syndicates, Matteo was currently resident, 99 at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado. He spent 23 hours a day in a concrete box smaller than his old walk-in closet. His assets, the yachts, the Hamptons estate, the private jet he tried to flee in, had all been seized and liquidated. Every single penny had been redirected into a victims' compensation fund, which had financed the very building James was about to open. Then there was Gavin Thorne, the prosecutor who had sneered at James, who had called him a predator. Thorne had been disbarred within 48 hours of the trial, but the humiliation didn't stop there. Because he had used his law license to facilitate fraud, his sentence was harsh. He was currently serving 10 years in a medium-security facility in Pennsylvania. Rumor had it he was working in the prison library, reshelving books for 12 cents an hour. A poetic justice for a man who had once charged $1,000 an hour to lie. And Silas Holloway, the judge. He had been the hardest to topple, but Amelia's task force had been thorough. They found the offshore accounts where Sterling had been paying his mortgage. Holloway had taken a plea deal to avoid dying in prison. He was out of the judiciary, stripped of his pension, and living in a small, rented apartment in Queens, his name permanently etched onto the disgraced officials' registry. "They are where they belong," Amelia said firmly, pulling James back to the present. "And we are where we belong. Don't let their ghosts haunt this building, James. You built this on a foundation of truth. It's clean." "Mr. Vance? Mrs. Vance Strathmore?" A young production assistant with a headset poked her head into the tent. "We're ready for you. The mayor is finishing his introduction. There are a lot of people out there." James took a deep breath. "Showtime." He offered his arm to his wife. "Shall we, Madam Chief Justice?" "We shall, Mr. Architect." As they walked out of the tent and onto the raised stage, the wall of sound hit them. It wasn't the hostile murmur of a courtroom gallery. It was a roar of applause. Flashbulbs popped in a blinding staccato rhythm. The crowd was massive. It wasn't just the press and the politicians. It was the community. There were families from the neighborhood, veterans who would be living in the new shelter units, and young students who would be using the library. James approached the podium. He waited for the applause to die down. He looked out at the sea of faces, and for a moment his throat tightened. "Thank you," he said, his voice amplified across the plaza. "A year ago, I stood in a room not far from here, and I was told that I was worthless. I was told that greed was the only language the world understood." He placed his hand on the smooth, cool stone of the podium. "But I learned something that day," James continued. "I learned that lies are like bad concrete. They might look solid at first. You can paint over them, you can dress them up in expensive suits. But eventually, under pressure, they crack. They always crack." He looked at Amelia, who was sitting to his right, legs crossed, looking out at the crowd with a serene smile. "This building is made of steel and glass," James said, his voice rising. "But its foundation is something stronger. It was built by the people who refused to look away. It was funded by the recovered, stolen wealth of those who thought they were untouchable. This is the Vance Community Center, but it belongs to the truth." The crowd erupted again. James stepped back, motioning for Amelia to join him. As she stood up, the energy shifted. The respect for James was palpable, but the reverence for Amelia was different. She was the enigma, the silent judge, the woman who had brought down a titan without raising her voice. She didn't give a speech. She simply took the oversized ceremonial scissors, looked at the red ribbon, and sliced through it with a single, decisive cut. "Open," she said. The reception that followed was a whirlwind of champagne and congratulations. The city's elite, the ones who hadn't been indicted, were swarming, desperate to be seen aligning themselves with the new power couple. James and Amelia navigated the room with practiced ease. They were standing near the atrium, admiring the way the light hit the central staircase, when a man approached them. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, wearing a suit that was just a little too shiny and a watch that was far too big. He held a glass of scotch and carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never been told no. "James Vance," the man said, extending a hand. "Preston Calloway, Calloway Hedge Fund." James shook the hand politely. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Calloway. Enjoying the opening?" "It's quaint," Preston said, looking around with a critical, condescending smirk. "A bit sentimental for my taste, using all this reclaimed wood. But I suppose the charity crowd eats that stuff up. Nice tax write-off, I bet." James stiffened. The insult was veiled, but it was there. Preston turned his gaze to Amelia. He didn't know who she was, or perhaps he simply didn't care to know. To him, she was just the architect's wife. "And you must be the support system," Preston said, flashing a charming, empty smile. "It's always good to have a pretty face at these things. Helps with the donors. Do you do event planning, sweetheart, or just interior design?" The air in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur Miller, James's lawyer, was standing nearby. He stopped chewing his shrimp puff. He watched with wide eyes. He knew that look on Amelia's face. Amelia took a slow sip of her sparkling water. She lowered the glass. She adjusted her glasses, the same black-rimmed ones she had worn in court. "I don't do interiors, Mr. Calloway," Amelia said. Her voice was pleasant, melodic even. "I specialize in structural integrity and risk assessment." Preston laughed, a dismissive bark. "Risk assessment? Darling, I run a $3 billion hedge fund. I am the risk." "Is that so?" Amelia asked. She took a step closer to him. "Preston Calloway, Calloway Hedge Fund. You operate out of the 44th floor of the Zephyr building, correct?" Preston blinked, surprised. "Yeah, that's right." "And you recently filed a prospectus with the SEC for a new cryptocurrency derivative fund," Amelia continued, her tone conversational, "promising returns of 20% per quarter." Preston's smile faltered. That's proprietary information. The prospectus hasn't been made public yet." "No, it hasn't," Amelia agreed. "But the flagged transaction report from the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority has been filed, specifically the transfer of $12 million from an account linked to your firm into a personal holding company in Belize yesterday afternoon." Preston went pale. The glass of scotch trembled in his hand. Who are you?" Amelia didn't answer the question. She simply tilted her head. "The irony, Mr. Calloway," she said, "is that you're standing in a building funded by men who thought they were smarter than the oversight committees. Men who thought they could hide money in Belize or Antigua. Matteo Sterling thought that too." She reached out and gently plucked a piece of lint from Preston's lapel. "I am the chair of the Judicial Integrity Task Force," she whispered, loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear. "And my team has a very interesting algorithm that tracks sudden, large offshore movements from mid-sized hedge funds. You might want to check your phone, Preston. I believe the SEC just froze your domestic assets about 3 minutes ago." As if on cue, Preston's phone buzzed in his pocket. Then it buzzed again, and again, a frantic succession of notifications. He pulled it out, his hands shaking violently. He stared at the screen, his eyes bulging. I have to go," Preston stammered. He looked at Amelia with pure terror. "I have to make a call." "I wouldn't bother," Amelia called after him as he sprinted toward the exit. The marshals are likely waiting by your car." She turned back to James, who was grinning from ear to ear. "You are terrifying," James said, shaking his head in wonder. "Absolutely terrifying." "I just hate bullies," Amelia said, smoothing her dress. "And I really hate it when they interrupt my evening." The party continued into the night. As the guests began to filter out, leaving the great hall quiet, James and Amelia walked up the central staircase to the rooftop garden. The city lights were twinkling around them, a sea of diamonds. Below them, the noise of the traffic was a distant hum. James leaned against the railing, looking out at the empire of concrete and steel. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the other buildings. He cared about the woman standing next to him. "You know," James said softly, "I used to think my legacy would be the skyscrapers. I wanted to build the tallest tower. I wanted my name on the skyline." "And now?" Amelia asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Now," James said, "I realize that the most important thing I ever built was us. This partnership, the trust." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Amelia, you sat in that back row for weeks. You let them humiliate us. You waited. It must have been agony." "It was," she admitted, "but I knew something they didn't." "What was that?" "I knew who you were," she said. "I knew that you were a good man, and I knew that good men are worth fighting for. The law is a tool, James. It can be used as a weapon by men like Thorne, or it can be a shield. I just made sure you had the shield." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. "I have a present for you," she said, "for the opening." James opened the box. Inside was a pair of cufflinks. They were silver, shaped like tiny gavels, but engraved with a small compass. "The compass," Amelia explained, "is so you never lose your way. And the gavel, well, that's just to remind you who sleeps next to you." James laughed, tears pricking his eyes. He fastened them onto his cuffs. "I love you, Amelia Vance Strathmore." "I love you, James Vance." They stood together on the roof, the architect and the judge, watching the city that they had forced to be honest. They had started in the back row, in the shadows, ignored and belittled. But as they stood there, bathed in the light of the building that truth had built, they knew one thing for certain. They would never be in the back row again. And that is the incredible story of how James and Amelia Vance turned the tables on a corrupt system. It just goes to show that you should never judge a book by its cover, or a wife by her quiet demeanor. Amelia proved that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it just needs the right evidence and perfect timing. I hope you enjoyed this story of ultimate karma and justice. If you felt that satisfaction when the judge was arrested, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories about arrogant billionaires getting exactly what they deserve, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a daily upload. What would you have done if you were in James's shoes? Would you have forgiven Matteo, or did he get what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next video with another crazy story.